Hi, I'm Becca. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a mixed race, Chinese and Jewish, and white person. And I identify as a hetero, demi, asexual person.
I'm Jacob. I use they, them pronouns. And I'm mixed race, Ashkenazi Jewish, and Thai/Chinese on my mom's side. And I identify as non-binary and bisexual.
I'm Nina. I use she, her pronouns. I am mixed race and come from an interfaith family, so I have white Ashkenazi Jewish heritage as well as Indian and Malay on my mother's side, which is Muslim faith, and I identify as a bisexual as well. So, where would we like to start?
We could do the coming out story. I hate it, but I think, maybe it's a good standpoint of kind of figuring out what it's like to come out to, a multicultural family if you're out to them. And I can go first because it's a heck of a topic. Definitely coming out as ace, as an Asian person where you're already fighting stereotypes about the lotus blossom woman who's, docile and submissive and isn't naughty, and then you also have the dragon lady or the promiscuous Asian woman, all these stereotypes, just toss those aside. Since college I was able to identify with other asexual people, and everything is a spectrum, so it took a while for me to accept it because I was a person who I like dating, even though dating has its tribulations as it does. And for me personally, I finally came out on Facebook in 2018, just after seeing more representation of people with my identity, just being yeah, there's a whole spectrum of people. So just because, I'm on one part of the spectrum doesn't mean that I'm the perfect ace person, everyone is who they are. And if you know who you are and you've gone through it many years, in your head, or even just, several months, that's valid enough. So I came out on a Facebook status to people and I was if pride was a donut, I'm the donut hole of, LGBTQ, and I'm also a bagel of the straight ally bagel. That's how I kind of came out there.
This is a really interesting thing to even think about. I was in a class the other day because I'm doing my master's in Asian American studies, and so there's all these Asian American individuals in that space, and some of them are queer, some of them are not. But somebody was saying how coming out is a very white experience, that generally Asian Americans in their experience didn't as frequently go through the traditional coming out story that we see. And I was thinking about that, and it was really interesting because I feel like my coming out was primarily catered towards the white side of my family and not so much the Asian side. And I don't know if that's because of the religious overlay, where Muslim culture is, if you're very strict and traditional, pretty homophobic. And so my entire maternal side back in Malaysia do not know that I identify as queer, will likely never know that I identify as queer, but my Jewish grandparents and my Jewish aunts and family do know. They have been told. So I think that's just something that I want to give voice to, that it has not been equal for me on both sides in terms of who I felt allowed to come out to, and where that took place was definitely kind of uneven in terms of who was willing to hear that, who wasn't. I think my immediate family definitely there was no problems or anything like that. But I remember that a couple years ago, we went back to visit my family in Malaysia, and it was in June during Pride Month. And I remember my mom pulling me aside, and she didn't mean anything by it. I don't view it as a bad thing, but she reminded me not to mention pride or like my relation to it while we were in Malaysia around that side of the family. At first I was like, okay, that's like super awful, and I like got all like defensive and I threw a mini tantrum, but like in hindsight I'm like, yeah, like for the way that that culture is set up, that totally makes sense, that that's something that like I kind of have to just keep back or hidden, or just kind of like that exists here in America, and that's kind of the extent to where it's allowed to exist. So that's my personal experience with the coming out aspect anyway.
Yeah, and that's actually, I mean, it's very interesting because I came from a very, like, both my parents are very progressive, liberal people. They met in, like, Los Angeles in the 80s, and they both have, like, a good number of gay friends, and they used to tell me about, like, their experiences as friends of, like, people in the gay community as, like, young adults, to, like, teach me and my brother about, like, acceptance. But even though, like, they, of course, like, are not homophobic people, like, whenever I come out to them, it always feels like they don't, like, or at least they didn't fully believe it. I mean, now they do, because I'm dating a man, so, you know, it's it'd be difficult to not fully believe. But I think it's kind of this thing where, and I'm not bad-mouthing my parents at all, but it's like harder to believe, even if you are a progressive person, I guess, that your child is actually queer. And I think it's kind of this thing where, since I wasn't particularly whatever particular stereotype you would want for a queer person, it was perhaps a little harder to believe. So it's kind of that interesting thing where your stated values and like what you're actually putting out in the world to the people that are close to you can have a slight conflict.
That's huge. I was like listening to you talk and I was like, oh my God, I totally vibe with this, because I think there is, I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think in my experience, there's a little bit of that element of like, I have no problems with it, but like, they can do that, not in my house, like not in my family, like that's not a thing that exists in my circle of relatives or whatever. I'm not going to judge you outside in the world if y'all want to be gay or like whatever, but in my household, that's not a thing.
I just don't believe it's there.
Exactly. There's no way that anybody in this family could possibly, right? And I totally hear that. And especially with the point about like not fitting the stereotype, because like I dated multiple men in a row. I also came out while I was in a relationship with a man. And so everyone was like, I don't understand. You have a boyfriend. Like, how are you queer? We've only seen boyfriends. And so there was that transition too of like, let's talk about that.
Yeah. And I think also it's partially that my parents, because they are in a mixed race relationship, they were born in the late 50s, and so like they are aware that their own relationship was in a way transgressive. So they see themselves as like, we're very progressive on that, so of course we're accepting, but then there's not always a full thinking through of their own biases all the time.
Yeah, I think just coming out as ace is a newer concept, I think, to my parents. I mean, I'm not out to my dad. He's not on social media or anything, so it doesn't really matter. He would just think that I'm describing myself as celibate, maybe similar to how if you're, you know, presenting as one way, but then, you know, actually identifying as another way. I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with who are on spectrums, so to speak. You know, I came out to my mom and my siblings kind of get it a little bit more, but nobody wants to talk to me about it. That's why the LGBTQ community is really important, because community is there to be like, yeah, we're here to talk about it, because, you know, our families don't necessarily want to like admit that there could be somebody who's queer in the family. It is just such a strange thing to be like, my parents probably thought they were more progressive by dating, you know, interracially and marrying interracially, but then it's like bring sexuality into the conversation and then it's just kind of awkward. Like for people, I don't know. I really like hearing y'all's stories, because like it makes me kind of like, oh yeah, like there is the conversation and there's the presenting part of it, but I think there's also, you know, a lot deeper of stuff.
What you said about like, oh, my siblings, my mom, they accept it, but they don't want to talk about it. I think there is actually a big difference, like a really important difference where, of course, there are families that won't accept you, but like in a lot of families, it's easy to get acceptance, but then you, like your sexuality or your gender identity can kind of become like not like a family secret, but it's kind of swept under the rug. For example, my Vava, who's 91, I'm not necessarily going to explain my sexuality to her. She's
yeah, same with my grandparents.
She's an accepting woman relative to someone born in the 1920s, but it's not necessarily. I don't know. I think there is a sense of, and this is something that I've kind of internalized, and I'm not sure if, I don't want to speak for everyone here, and I would love to hear what other people think, but like a sort of sense of family duty to like pick and choose your battles in terms of talking about identity.
Oh, I feel that's so hard. I think like particularly as somebody who is currently pursuing a further degree in like racial studies, like I'm known in the family as the person to constantly be talking about like racial injustice and discrimination, as well intentioned as it is. Sometimes the other people in my family who aren't in that space all the time are like, you have so many like spears upon which you are crusading a little bit. And so I totally hear you on the like picking battles thing, because you know, today I could wake up and I could fight for like mixed race representation and talk about like how Hollywood's a mess and blah, blah, blah. And then in 2 hours want to talk about like queer baiting and, you know, fake representation and straight people playing queer characters and like all of the things. And I think sometimes people around me who aren't like mired in that existence are like, can you set it down? Can you set one of them down? Can you maybe take a break from like telling me how everything is unequal and oppression and unfair? And so that's hard. And also for me, like in addition, I was listening to you talk, Jacob, and I was thinking about how this might be specific to my experience, but as somebody who is bisexual but has only ever had long-term relationships with men, I get a lot of like kind of gatekeeping from my family a little bit. Like if they don't see that I'm in a like traditionally queer relationship, the fact that I identify as bisexual doesn't really matter that much. It's like, okay, cool, like I came out, they know that I have attraction to women, but the fact that I'm in a relationship with a man means that I'm just back to normal or whatever.
Yeah, like you're passing. You're like
exactly.
Hetero-passing.
The overlapping of how passing works, like I wanted to bring that up later, and I definitely will, but it's definitely that kind of thing. Like sometimes I'll like make jokes. I'll come downstairs and I'll be like, look, I dressed extra gay today. And my mom's like, but you're not really that gay. Like, I feel like you really want to be gay, but you're not that gay because you're dating a guy. And I'm like, there are no hours in the world for us to like fully have this out. And I think that it's a generational thing a little bit. And the passing for sure applies to that. So I don't take offense to it, but I do hear you in that like, I think that it's a process of recognizing not everybody understands that unless you're in like a same-sex relationship, you are actually still queer. Like that's not the only version of LGBTQ that exists. But I think that that's hard, converting people's like limited understanding of what it means to actually be queer sometimes.
Yeah, I have a question I guess I want to throw out there. Like, when it comes to your sexual identity and, like, your Jewishness, do you think it blends well? Like, you know, is there any friction that you would say between your LGBTQ plus identity and your Jewishness? Because I remember people used to say like, oh, because you're Jewish, like that means masturbation is cool for you. You know, have y'all heard that? Like,
I have not, but
okay,
wow,
that's in there. That is in. I don't know where it's in.
I don't know where either. I can never find it, and I don't want to ask my rabbi because it's too awkward. But I know that that's like a thing, and like I think that's just so funny that Jewishness, and especially like some of the religious underties, are very liberating, like sexual liberation. You know, if your wife isn't pleased, that's something that you need to like work on, you know, stuff like that, just that you hear in conversations of Jewishness and like sexuality. And I think, you know, as somebody who identifies as ace, and I would say like I'm ace passing because I don't really, you know, have long-term relationships that often. But that's something that I know for me, like I'm like, yes, that's exactly what we need in our liberation, you know, is that we need where everything's okay. Everything's okay baseline, and that's what makes it free for people to choose what they want and to allow, consent to really thrive within that. And I think that's a part of why I got pulled towards Judaism more, maybe because there's room for conversation. Whereas like the Catholic side of my family, the Chinese Catholic folks, that's who I'm not out to. It's just kind of like not worth it to fight that battle, picking our battles. I think that's such a theme today. Picking our battles and realizing that a place where you're allowed to have conversation and you're allowed to continue to just fight more and more of like, I am valid as who I am. That's what really pulls me to that. Because, there's also just the immigrant mentality too, I think is something that's hard to fight against. Like my dad's an immigrant, and it was hard enough for him to just survive and to find a job, and to add another thing that could be a plight in my own life as his child. It causes friction. So I think, there's definitely less friction for me when it comes to like my identity and my Jewishness, and allowing that liberation space is important.
Yeah, I definitely feel you on that. I don't know. I feel like the Jewish communities that I've been in have been, in general, very accepting, or at least the leadership has been very accepting of queer people broadly. The synagogue I went to in my hometown, like, was one of the first, I think, in California to like hold gay weddings or like gay services and stuff like that. I think though it's interesting to note, because this is similar to something that I was talking about in terms of Jewish acceptance of like racial diversity too, is that I think sometimes like more reform and reconstructionist and in general liberal Jewish like groups can kind of assume that they are more progressive than they actually are. They'll think, oh, we're more accepting of gay people or mixed race people than the ultra orthodox or the Catholics or insert X more conservative group there, and then they will kind of rest on their laurels and not actually like think about the other ways in which they are still lacking. And I think this kind of ties into what we were talking about in terms of like, people thinking like, I understand diversity and progressiveness in terms of like my mixed race relationship, or I understand about like a very stereotypical view of gay people or lesbian people. And that kind of stops them from fully exploring like, what about non-binary people? What about the whole spectrum of trans people and other queer people that are also part of my community?
I feel like there are levels, right, to all of this. Like there are levels upon which someone could be, I don't want to use the word enlightened, but that's just the first word that's coming to mind. Like the levels of which people understand the complexity of being mixed race or the complexity of being somebody who identifies as queer, right? So like you're saying, I think that being in Jewish spaces in terms of relating my sexual identity or being comfortable in my sexual identity in those spaces, between the two faiths that I come from, I would probably lean on the Jewish side a little bit more, like Becca was saying, just as a space that is more encompassing of like progressive, welcoming various experiences and backgrounds and things. But it's also really interesting because I attended the synagogue growing up that my grandparents had been going to for a long time. Like my whole family would go to their synagogue, and they're an aging population there for the most part. Like they're seniors. It's not a young synagogue. And so even though like their rabbi, she's hella cool and like I really love her and she's great, I do think that it's interesting to see like the way that space just exists because of the demographic that exists within it, right? They may be more progressive and liberal for sure. And it's like in the heart of the Bay Area, and my grandparents are like super chill and stuff like that. But I would, just because of some other experiences I've had, be a little bit hesitant to walk into a space with a ton of white, elderly Jewish people. And just because we're in the Bay Area, I would never assume that everyone in that room is going to be cool with a mixed race Asian bi chick hanging out in the room. So again, like, I do think there are levels to like the comfort that we may have in some of these spaces, or the degree to which a Jewish space is accommodating of people who aren't like the old traditional, version of Jewish, right?
And it could be like, I don't know about y'all, but it could be, I think, because my Jewish spaces are white, unfortunately. And like, with growing Jew of color spaces, I do start to realize like, oh, right, like, these folks have dealt with their own, culture clash. And so not really knowing where they stand when it comes to a sexuality conversation is kind of like, it's a bit more of a question mark, I guess, but not in a bad way. I think it's just, I know what a white Jewish liberal space looks like, and I have yet to like understand what a Jew of color, maybe not so liberal space looks like.
I mean, I think that's the thing about spaces for Jews of color is that they're so not new, because I mean they've been around. There've been Jews of color for centuries and centuries, but in their modern iteration are still very much unformed. And I guess it's up to us in some way to like figure out how to make them places that accept like diversity in the community in all of their forms. And so that's kind of a tricky thing to balance and to be thinking about.
We talk about this picking our battles theme that we've come upon today, right? If you were to enter into like a Jews of color space, I could see how we would all very easily be able to commiserate with each other on the basis of like, y'all ever been in a white Jewish space? Y'all ever felt stared at because you were in a white Jewish space? Like, cool. But if some of us were to then like try to expand that conversation, like, okay, here's another axis along which Jewish space has felt exclusionary, has felt restrictive, has felt invalidating of my identity. I haven't been in enough Jews of color spaces to know whether or not that's something where like there is room for that extra added layer of struggle to be discussed, or if it's like, no, we're still working through problem one. We will get to problem two after we've sorted out problem one. I mean, part of my thing is I was only in white Jewish spaces prior to LUNAR existing. I had never been in a Jews of color space. I didn't even know that they existed. So it's definitely something that I would like to figure out and work through, just because I think there's potential for a lot more acceptance in those spaces, but I don't want to speak out of turn if I haven't, been in enough of those spaces to know what that looks like. I do want to talk about passing. I want to talk about like multiple layers of passing, because I literally read like a freaking academic study that was done about how like experiences of being passing in a multiracial way and like passing in a queer way, like the brain goes through similar processes and it's like similar for people. Like if you've gone through one of them, when you go through the second one, your brain recognizes that process and it's like very, very similar the way that you like consciously recognize. So I just wanted to know if like y'all had ever noticed that. I don't know if this is like a thing, but I always felt like I had to come out as mixed race. Like I had to come out as Asian and be like, look, I'm not white. I'm not Latina either. I know you guys want me to be, but I'm not. I'm actually Asian. And it was like a whole thing. And so then when I realized I was bi, I was like, oh, I've done this before. And like, I pass as other stuff racially. I pass as heterosexual because I'm in a long-term relationship with a man. So those types of things always stick with me in terms of like, I processed one through having processed the other. And I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts or experiences you wanted to share.
It makes me think of like soy milk. Like when you go through the one process and then you can go through another process if you want that type of soy milk, but like you don't have to. So it's like, it depends on how the soy milk you want to come out kind of thing. But yeah, I think that makes complete sense. Just thinking of what it's like to translate who you are to the general public of society that has been ingrained with all this heteronormative BS and like, monoracial BS, even though the monoracials can be nice, but just saying it's a whole lot of BS that the country feels more divided than it actually is. And I think the same way with how, the LGBTQ community looks like, it's not just white people at Pride, it's so much more.
Yeah, I think, Nina, I would actually love to, read that study, because that sounds really, really, interesting. Because I think philosophically, I really do approach how I am perceived as a queer person and how I am perceived as a mixed race person kind of in the same way, in that I am only interested in my identity being legible / understandable to other people who kind of share some elements of that. I don't necessarily care all that much about how white people read me a lot of the time. I don't it's always interesting to hear what they think is going on here. I got Greek once, which is interesting. I don't know about that. And similarly, on a certain level, I'm not sure how much it matters to me for straight people to understand what it means when I say I'm non-binary and bisexual. I think that what I care about there is how people who share these identities with me how we can find community together. And so I guess I pass sometimes. I think racially wise, I'm not sure what I pass as, but people are confused by me, and that's great. But I've never been interested in pursuing passing, I've never tailored any part of my experience towards that, I don't think.
That totally makes sense. I think that for a long time, I don't know when you guys had your realization that you were a queer person, but mine wasn't until college. So I thought I was heterosexual for a hella long time. And I think that's part of the reason why it was a whole process for me, because it took me a long time to figure that out. Just like it also took me a long time to fully become comfortable with identifying as someone that was mixed race and not oh, I'm almost white, but not quite, because I was raised in super white spaces. So it might have been the time in which I began to conceptualize of my mixed race identity and my queer identity kind of almost the same time, in the same sort of I was in college, I was taking classes that had to do with racial identity, classes that had to do very tiny, but a little bit about being queer. And so just having those recognitions at the same time, I think forced me to be okay, I understand. These are things that are kind of similar and blah, 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 blah. But that idea of not attempting to pass is definitely something that I relate to more now after, sitting with both those identities for a while and just being I don't really care what you think when you see me.
Yeah, definitely.
I know how I identify, so.
I love that, because I think that's what it means to really be empowered in who you are, is just saying if they're not going to bring it up, I'm going to bring it up, because, it's important to me to be my full self in a conversation with a random or, with a family member who I trust. And I think it really is essential, I think, in just going forward and feeling safe, to be empowered in a space as well. And I think with passing of race versus my sexuality and kind of figuring out when to break the mold of, society, I think I knew about my race in junior high, probably. I think luckily I had a, family that was a friend family, that they were also white and Asian, mixed race, and we used to call ourselves Wasians. That was our way to empower ourselves. We're yeah, we're Wasian, that's who we are. And then I think in college, just because I went to an LGBTQ and ally meeting at my dorm freshman year, and the thing is, I like to think I walked in there an ally, and then I walked out there an ace person, because then I started to realize, oh, wait, there's more to just the way that, I experience romantic attraction versus sexual attraction. And it's important to just feel validated enough to just be proud of who I am and to allow a conversation to open for other people. Because I think that's what the scary thing is that if you're the only person in the room that's both a mixed race, you know, situation and a sexuality person, the worst thing is that you're gonna be in that room for like maybe 30 minutes to an hour, and then, you know, then you're out of there, and then you get to find your people, you know, along the way. And it can be daunting almost to be like all of these things. Like, I have a joke that I've been trying to work on that is like, when it comes to all my identities, like going down the list, I feels like I have a grocery list, and it's the weirdest grocery store ever, you know, that I have to go to all these aisles and be like, all right, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. And it's worth it because I got to go get my groceries, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think sometimes I've realized it's okay to go to multiple stores, which I guess complicates the metaphor.
Yes.
But like as both a person with multiple identities and a person who has complicated recipes that they like to make, it's sometimes okay. Like, sometimes it's better to go to multiple places and get the best version of everything you want, as opposed to accepting some kind of substitute from one place that you're comfortable with. And I think that's something where I've realized where, you know, there are community spaces where I'm okay with not being perceived in all my identities. Like, I was in a Jewish reading group, doing Saturday readings and services and stuff, and I was like, I don't necessarily need to be perceived as a queer person here or as a Asian person here. Like, this is for getting really into these parts of my Jewish identity. And I think part of coming to terms with all the different facets has been realizing you are always all these things, but you don't always have to be broadcasting all of them. And that's not because you're trying to appease the people with you. It's a matter of getting the most out of experiences, to me.
I'm actually really glad you said that, because I think that is something that prior to the pandemic, actually, I was really struggling with, because I had pretty much begun to fully ground myself in Asian American spaces, but I didn't have a Jewish community. I didn't really have a queer community, or besides I don't know, a couple personal friends. And so I was like, there will never be ever a space in which other people hold all of these identities. You know, I'd been in conversations where people were talking about representation. I was like, there will never be anybody who represents every single part of me. That's not physically possible. There are too many things. But then I feel through the pandemic, just the fact that social networks were flung so far, you know, and new groups were created, old groups were completely disbanded, right? Stumbling into LUNAR, things like that really emphasize that idea that you're talking about of it's okay to seek different spaces for different things if those spaces will create the most authentic version of whatever you are in that space for. And it's been really grounding to have spaces where it's as you said, okay, this is my Jewish space where I feel comfortable here, my Jews of color space, I'm really happy here. And this is where, you know, all my queer community is located, and that's really affirming there. And just recognizing that, I think, took a little bit for me. But when you have all these identities, like Becca was saying, it's hard to find one spot where no, we got you on the mixed race, we got you on the religion thing, we got you on the queer thing. I mean, maybe that's a call to action for us to be we will create that space for all of the things.
Yeah, I think it is a question of having all these identities and being proud of all these identities and cherishing them, but not letting it kind of atomize you relative to the rest of the community and be oh, I don't share this with you, and so therefore we can't be in solidarity, or we can't even be in community. And I think realizing that even within the queer community, or even within Jewish and Asian communities, I think something that LUNAR has been really helpful for me in my thinking is that there's a lot of diversity in all the different ways to be Asian and Jewish, even that very narrow slice. And I think it's really been helpful to see oh, we may not have exactly the same experiences, but there's a lot of ways in which we can support each other and cherish each other.
This has been good. This feels like a therapy session. This has been fantastic. Who needs a therapist when you can just get on Zoom with people who share the same identities? This has been fantastic.
No, I mean, I think there's something to it. It's healing, especially, I don't know. Before LUNAR, there was not a huge number of Asian Jewish people, and especially not queer Asian Jewish people in my life. There was one or two, actually, which is kind of wild. But
that's impressive. There was not one in mine. That's props to you for having anybody outside of a sibling. That's,
you got to cast a wide net, you know.
Thank you for the therapy, and thank you for hearing me and relating to me and
feeling seen.
I will be sure to send you that article.
Yeah.
Just about being mixed and being queer at the same time. It was definitely an eye-opening read when I read it. So
yeah, that sounds really cool.
I will send that along. But thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you both.